Chapter 5 Hark, hark, the dogs do bark. Through her tears, Nanny Cook stared towards the park. She could now see Mrs. Dearly, Nanny Butler, and the 3 dogs, who had just turned for home. It seemed a strange and terrible thing that they could be strolling along so happily when every step brought them nearer to such dreadful news. As they came across the outer circle, Nanny Cook ran to meet them, crying so much that Mrs. Dearly found it hard to understand what had happened. The dogs heard the word puppies, and Nanny Cook's tears, and rushed down to the area. Then they went dashing over the whole house, searching. Every few minutes Mrs. and Perdita howled, and Pongo barked furiously. While the dogs searched and the nannies cried on each other's shoulders, Mrs. Dearly telephoned Mr. Dearly. He came home at once, bringing with him one of the top men from Scotland Yard. The top man found a bit of sacking on the area railings and said the puppies must have been dropped into sacks and driven away in the black van. He promised to comb the underworld, but warned the Dearlys that stolen dogs were seldom recovered unless a reward was offered. A reward seemed an unreasonable thing to offer to a thief, but Mr. Dearly was willing to offer it. He rushed to Fleet Street and had large advertisements put on the front pages of the evening papers. This was rather expensive, and arranged for even larger advertisements to be on the front pages of the next day's morning papers. This was even more expensive. Beyond this, there seemed nothing he or Mrs. Dearly could do except try to comfort each other and comfort the nannies and the dogs. Soon the nannies stopped crying and joined in the comforting, and prepared beautiful meals which nobody felt like eating. And at last night fell on the stricken household. Worn out, the 3 dogs lay in their baskets in front of the kitchen fire. "Think of my baby cad pig in a sack," said Mrs. with a sob. "Her big brother Patch will take care of her," said Pongo soothingly, though he felt most unsoothed himself. "Look, he's so brave. He will bite the thieves," wailed Perdita. "And then they will kill him." "No, they won't," said Pongo. "The pups were stolen because they are valuable. No one will kill them. They are only valuable while they are alive." But even as he said this, a terrible suspicion was forming in his mind, and it grew and grew as the night wore on. Long after Mrs. and Perdita, utterly exhausted, had fallen asleep, he lay awake, staring at the fire, chewing the wick of his basket as a man might have smoked a pipe. Anyone who did not know Pongo well would have thought him handsome, amusing, and charming, but not particularly clever. Even the Dearlys did not quite realize the depths of his mind. He was often still so puppyish. He would run after balls and sticks, climb into laps far too small to hold him, roll over on his back to have his stomach scratched. How was anyone to guess that this playful creature owned one of the keenest brains in dogdom? It was at work now. All through the long December night he put 2 and 2 together and made 4. Once or twice he almost made 5. He had no intention of alarming Mrs. and Perdita with his suspicions. Poor Pongo! He not only suffered on his own account, as a father, he also suffered on the account of 2 mothers. For he had come to feel the puppies had 2 mothers, though he never felt he had 2 wives. He looked on Perdita as a much-loved young sister. He would say nothing about his worst fears until he was quite sure. Meanwhile, there was an important task ahead of him. He was still planning it when the nannies came down to start another day. As a rule, this was a splendid time, with the fire freshly made, plenty of food around, and the puppies at their most playful. This morning, well, as Nanny Butler said, it just didn't bear thinking about, but she thought about it, and so did everyone else in that pupless house. No good news came during the day, but the Dearlys were surprised and relieved to find that the dogs ate well. Pongo had been firm. "You girls had got to keep your strength up." And there was an even greater surprise in the afternoon. Pongo and Mrs. showed very plainly that they wanted to take the Dearlys for a walk. Perdita did not. She was determined to stay at home in case any pup returned and was in need of a wash. Cold weather had come at last. Christmas was only a week away. "Mrs. must wear her coat," said Mrs. Dearly. It was a beautiful blue coat with a white binding. Mrs. was very proud of it. Coats had been bought for Pongo and Perdita too, but Pongo had made it clear he disliked wearing his. So the coat was put on Mrs., and both dogs were dressed in their handsome chain collars. And then they put the Dearlys on their leashes and led them into the park. From the first, it was quite clear the dogs knew just where they wanted to go. Very firmly they led the way right across the park, across the road, into the open space which is called Primrose Hill. This did not surprise the Dearlys, as it had always been a favorite walk. What did surprise them was the way Pongo and Mrs. behaved when they got to the top of the hill. They stood side by side and they barked. They barked to the north, they barked to the south, they barked to the east and west. And each time they changed their positions, they began to bark with 3 very strange, short, sharp barks. "Anyone would think they were signaling," said Mr. Dearly, but he did not really mean it, and they were signaling. Many people must have noticed how dogs like to bark in the early evening. Indeed, twilight has sometimes been called dogs' barking time. Busy town dogs bark less than country dogs, but all dogs know all about the twilight barking. It is their way of keeping in touch with distant friends, passing on important news, enjoying a good gossip. But none of the dogs who answered Pongo and Mrs. expected to enjoy a gossip, for 3 short, sharp barks meant help, help, help. No dog sends that signal unless the need is desperate, and no dog who hears it ever fails to respond. Within a few minutes, the news of the stolen puppies was traveling across England, and every dog who heard at once turned detective. Dogs living in London's underworld, hard-bitten characters, also hard-biting, set out to explore sinister alleys where dog thieves lurk. Dogs and pet shops hastened to make quite sure all puppies offered for sale were not Dalmatians in disguise. And dogs who could do nothing else swiftly handed on the news, spreading it through London and on through the suburbs, and on to the open country. Help! 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 15 Dalmatians puppies stolen. Send news to Pongo and Mrs. Pongo, of Regent's Park, London. End of message. Pongo and Mrs. hoped all this would be happening. But all they really knew was that they had made contact with dogs near enough to answer them, and that those dogs would be standing by at twilight the next evening to relay any news that had come along.